Hi, today I'll be delving into a rather controversial group which has been linked to multiple deaths, and whom by covering might get me into some hot water: Scientology. Now, if you find value in anything I've done, all I ask is that you hit that subscribe button, because it really does help me. Now let's dive right in. Picture this: Clearwater, Florida, November 18th, 1995. Seems like an average day, right? Well, it would be until things took a rather bizarre turn. A woman by the name of Lisa McPherson, after having had a minor car accident, started stripping down and walking stark naked down the street, pleading for help. Seems kinda crazy, right? But I mean, it's Florida. But when you fast forward 17 days, things get a little bit stranger. She's found dead. Not in a hospital, not in a medical facility, but in a shady hotel room. And she was supposedly under the care of the Church of Scientology. Now, if you haven't heard of Scientology, buckle up, since it's not your typical religion. Some would even argue that it's a cult, and it's been under the microscope and severe scrutiny for years due to its secrecy, multiple cases of alleged abuse, bribery of government, and a myriad of other shady practices. But let's rewind just a bit. Clearwater, Florida is like ground zero for Scientology. It's where they set up shop, and boy did they make waves. And this was where they set up their global HQ, along with being the home of one of Scientology's most recognizable landmarks. From there, they have pulled the strings on their worldwide operations, making headlines left and right. Back to Lisa's story, her death in this area raised many eyebrows. Here she was, in the hands of a religious organization known for being quite out there. And then she has what could be excused as a manic episode, then she's gone. And it's not the first time Scientology has been in hot water for a seemingly strange death, and it won't be the last. It's not even the most high-profile death tied to Scientology. You might ask yourself, what's the deal with Scientology anyway? Well, it seems to be a bizarre blend of religion, self-help, with a dash of sci-fi thrown in for good measure. Founded by L. Ron Hubbard, a rather poor science fiction writer turned religious guru, then prophet, who, and I quote, said, "You don't get rich writing science fiction. If you want to get rich, you start a religion." And through the religion he started, he promised to help you go clear and reach your full potential. Sounds great, right? Well, not really. Most people who look into it come to the conclusion that Scientology is a cult, a rather exploitative one at that. Many have gone as far as to accuse Scientology of brainwashing, manipulation, extortion, blackmail, the use of terror tactics, you name it, and they've done it. Or at least, they've been accused of doing so. So grab your tinfoil hats, because we're going to be diving into the deep and murky waters of Scientology. Alright, so it's time to roll back the clock to where it all started for Scientology, with one Lafayette Ronald Hubbard. Born March 13th, 1911, in good old Nebraska. The guy was quite the character. In essence, what he was boiled down to: a struggling writer who liked to spin wild stories and make even wilder claims. From being a blood brother of the Blackfoot Indians, and even a nuclear physicist, but none of it was true. He was a man who dropped out of college, having chased a civil engineering degree. Even his stint in the Navy wasn't much to write home about. However, the biggest leap of all was when Hubbard somehow went from writing science fiction stories, which many found to be rather poor, to founding Scientology. And I mean, if you look at a lot of his stories, they do seem to share some striking similarities to the eventual religion or cult that he would found. One which even had its own private navy, who would end up on the run from the US government. Now, I know this sounds like the plot from a bad movie, but it's the reality of the situation. Hell, the guy even violated Mexican waters by practicing unsanctioned gunnery, which got him kicked out of the military. But on to what sets Scientology apart from your run-of-the-mill movement or cult. And the religion he formed legitimately feels like a poorly written science fiction story. But since Hubbard was a bad science fiction writer, it tracks. So 75 million years ago, there was a galactic federation of planets ruled by Lord Xenu. And Xenu thought his planets were overpopulated, So he started to grab aliens from all different planets, and then he froze them. Those frozen bodies were packed into intergalactic cruisers and were brought to Earth. Then their frozen bodies were dumped into a volcano in Hawaii, and the aliens died, but their souls floated into the sky because of course they did. But Xenu was prepared for this, and since he did not want their souls to make it back to the Federation of Planets, he had their souls gathered, and those souls were taken into a brainwashing facility that Xenu had constructed on Earth, where they would spend days being brainwashed and tricked into believing a false reality. Then their souls would be released to roam the Earth, confused, right about the time when the dawn of man would commence. And those souls attached themselves onto all of mankind, causing the fears, confusions, and issues that plague humanity to this day. So basically he just sold them a bad science fiction story as a religion, and somehow it worked. But wait, there's more. A lot of the practices that Hubbard distilled to create Scientology come from the post-war era, where self-help was all the rage. Books about how to influence people were selling like hotcakes, and eventually Hubbard creates his own system, calling it Dianetics. Mind you, he's not the most creative of individuals, because Dianetics isn't exactly groundbreaking. It's more of a mashup of existing psychoanalytic theories with bits borrowed from Sigmund Freud, with a light sprinkling of hypnosis and other more fringe theories. But what Hubbard was able to do was package it all up in an easily digestible way. But rather than just release it as its own thing and leave it like that, he dubbed it Auditing, and he decided to all but patent it as a form of self-counseling, since he seemed to really hate psychiatry as a practice, and instead he marketed it as a way to replace therapy, since all you needed was a copy of his book and a buddy to co-audit with you, and you could avoid throwing your money away on a psychiatrist or a therapist. So what's the deal with auditing? Well, according to Hubbard, it was about taming the emotional mind, or what he called the reactive mind, where all your fears and hang-ups would reside. And the goal was to purge all those negative emotions, or what he would term engrams, throughout a series of probing questions and self-reflection. It was described as a way to renew your brain and think more logically and analytically. Ironically, this would be mixed into a religion full of aliens, ghosts, and an intergalactic federation of planets, which he had already played around with in his science fiction books, but he was able to push his thoughts and ideas with Dianetics much further than he was with his science fiction novels. Basically, he was playing mad scientist with a human psyche, and the way that he was packaging it, people were just eating it up. In essence, he was selling a quick fix for your mental woes. No therapist required, no social stigma of going to therapy, and it would be way cheaper. But that's not where it stopped. When he integrated it into the greater concept of Scientology, he would also add more to the concept, where two individuals would be sitting around talking from a distance, as an auditor would ask questions about your deepest, darkest thoughts and experiences, in a way very similar to the caricatures of therapy that are shown in media. But here's where he went further into Freudian type therapy, where instead of trying to get you to come to a realization through the auditing, which would become an integral part of Scientology, the auditor would more forcefully try to suggest or even help create memories and drag them to the surface. And these memories would be analyzed and treated as truth by something called the E-meter, and that would be your reality, regardless of how or why it would affect you. And once you purged yourself of all engrams, you would supposedly reach a state of enlightenment known as going clear. Basically, they would do almost anything to hit a physical reset button on the brain, which supposedly would cure and treat almost everything, from neuroses to physical ailments like poor eyesight, diabetes, even injuries suffered from a car accident or a nervous breakdown. However, there was no evidence to back any of Scientology's claims. Why was he so focused on treating almost everything with his patented diegetics? Well, it all stems from his stint in the Navy. After leaving and struggling to find his footing, he returned to writing, but life had other plans. Health issues and his time in the Navy left him grappling with mental issues. So what did he do? He reached out to the Veterans Association in order to get treatment, since he apparently was struggling with depression and thoughts of self-termination. But he got turned down. Apparently they did not consider his mental issues quite real, and apparently they did not see him, or at least this is what some claim, as suitable for therapy. According to Hubbard's ex-wife, this didn't just cause a personal grudge. No, it created an unwavering belief that he himself had the cure for all mental maladies. Despite understanding that he was not in the best headspace, Hubbard fancied himself a pioneer, a veritable maverick in the world of psychology. But every time he attempted to submit his ideas and theories, he was met by severe skepticism and rejection by the psychiatric community, because quite frankly, he was just selling psychobabble dressed up in sci-fi, and this just didn't sit well with him. So he creates his religion and it starts to grow quickly. All the while Hubbard is basking in the adoration of his followers as he spirals into paranoia. His ex-wife would go on to shed light onto how unstable he was becoming, revealing that the constant praise and heavy payments from his devotees at Dianetics seminars only fueled his delusions further. Understandably concerned, she would eventually plead for him to seek help. But instead of heeding her advice, Hubbard would take matters into his own hands, which is something his religion or cult, depending on what you term it, seemed to have a panache for doing. And he wound up kidnapping his daughter, then fleeing to Cuba, which resulted in leaving his daughter in the care of a mentally impaired woman. To add insult to injury, he would go on to torment Sarah with twisted phone calls, claiming that he slew their child, then constantly retracting his statements. Eventually, Sarah gets her daughter back, and Hubbard attempts to seek mental treatment. Unfortunately for everyone, Hubbard becomes even more obsessed with Dianetics, as it takes center stage in his life. He even linked up with a psychiatric clinic, but any hope faded away as his Dianetics gained traction. It became an overnight sensation, but the glory would be short-lived, as the hype would all but die down within a few years, leaving Hubbard back to square one, as he filed for bankruptcy. To make matters worse, he got hit with lawsuits for practicing medicine without a license. Around the same time, he was also parting ways with his wife in a rather messy divorce. Fast forward to 1952, and Hubbard was flat broke and looking for a new gig. That's when the idea of creating a church came into shape. And while he was an opportunist and ever a businessman, that wasn't all. He was genuinely fascinated with the occult, in large part thanks to his friend, Jack Persons, a rocket scientist and black magic enthusiast, which even some of the more suspected practices of this seeped into his ideas, and the exposure planted seeds for the spiritual ladder within Scientology. Whereas the followers would climb higher and higher in consciousness, they would pay costly sums for their enlightenment, gaining further and further knowledge of the core teachings of Scientology. All the while Hubbard would be controlling the strings, but it all had to be kept a secret for Scientology to function at all costs, supposedly much to our victims' misfortune, even at the cost of others' lives. Hubbard was a master manipulator, and this is evident in the design of many of the practices instilled in Scientology, which were all designed to keep the followers on the edge. And he genuinely structured much of the religion like a cult, where control and secrecy had to be kept at all times. And while some of the early courses, in essence being very basic psychology, were stated to actually have functional positive results by ex-Scientologists, due to them being a mix of mainstream therapy coupled with routines designed to put you in a slight hypnotic trance, it seemed the further and further they went, the closer and closer they were to a drink the Kool-Aid moment. And by the time they got to know the truth about Scientology, about the aliens, the ghosts, and the possessing, the followers would be so in deep emotionally, economically, and socially invested in Scientology, having poured countless hours and thousands of dollars into the program, that walking away wasn't an easy option. Instead, the system was designed to make them blame themselves for not seeing the desired results, doubling down and causing further mental stress and anxiety, and potential psychotic breaks, which could lead you to stripping on your clothes and running down the highway. Now, whether Hubbard believed any of his spiel, or if it was just a pitch to swindle people and take them for all they had, while maintaining clout and an amount of celebrity, it is hard to say if Hubbard actually believed any of it. But here's the kicker. Despite all the buzz surrounding Scientology in the 70s and 80s, and all the structures that Hubbard had built, there were an estimated 100,000 members at that time, but eventually it would dwindle to only 30,000. And those who remained would treat Hubbard's writings like gospel. After all, while he may not have had quality writing, he truly did have the quantity. But now let's focus on something that may have been involved in the death of Lisa McPherson, along with the deaths of others. At one point, Hubbard would create the C organization. These folks were really in for the long haul. And what did they do? Well, washing cars, which might seem mundane, picking up trash, and the like. But here's the thing. They would have to study, memorize, and pass quizzes on Hubbard's policy with detailing the correct way to wash a car, and the correct ways to deal with people who wanted to leave, traitors if you will, since in his writings, Scientology was a zero-sum game. Total loyalty was non-negotiable, especially when it came to policies like disconnection and fair game, which justify cutting all ties with anyone critical of the group. And as the creators of South Park would find, this would include members of their cast. And Scientology would not stop there. They also had individuals infiltrate governmental bodies, groups, agencies, or even animation studios in order to find any potential blackmail material or dirt they could in order to influence them. And this would lead into a blind devotion by the group due to the power they were able to amass by such actions. In essence, anyone was fair game, and it created an extremely toxic environment, which some speculate led to the practices and situation which eventually caused Lisa's death, underscoring the very real consequences of Scientology's more controversial practices. So let's unpack what happened to Lisa and how Scientology and its policies played a role. After the minor traffic accident, paramedics decided to take McPherson to the hospital, where staff would find no physical injuries, but suggested keeping her overnight for observation. But things took a turn when 8 members of the church showed up and convinced McPherson to refuse psychiatric care, leading to her leaving against medical advice. And instead of heading home, McPherson was taken to Fort Harrison Hotel, Scientology's flagship base in Clearwater. Here she would be placed under the care of the Flag Service Organization, a branch of Scientology with a naval-inspired name. The church claimed that McPherson was there for rest and relaxation. However, witnesses' statements contradict this. They say that she was put in something called an introspection rundown, a rather controversial procedure which Scientology created intended to help someone come back from a mental breakdown, and it's not exactly harmless. During the rundown, McPherson was isolated and unable to speak to anyone outside of the auditing sessions, and she was kept there alone, without any external contact, in an attempt to ironically help her deal with intrusive thoughts. Basically, she was in the hole, and it seems that this is in order to get them to fall back in line with the cult and keep them from leaving. Because when someone's deemed ready to leave isolation, the supervisor is there to write them a note asking about their readiness to rejoin the group, keeping them in the cult. If the response shows continued irrationality or irresponsibility, basically not wanting to be part of the cult or follow their practices, they are kept in isolation further still, with the reasons detailed in a follow-up note. Once they are deemed mentally stable, their isolation will end. Hubbard had hailed this process as miraculous, claiming it eliminated the need for psychiatry. Sadly, isolating an already mentally fragile person for extreme amounts of time and only talking to them to, in essence, push them into rejoining a cult wasn't what was needed to save McPherson. And supposedly something similar was done with the actor Isaac Hayes, except at that time, Scientology also included long stays in a sauna and severe physical activity, such as running on a treadmill, to treat physical maladies such as a stroke. These treatments weren't all that Hubbard's teachings created, in part due to Hubbard's ever-increasing paranoia and mental instability, leading him to see threats everywhere. And while he wasn't entirely off base, due to, in the late 1960s, the IRS pursuing him and his organization for tax evasion, leading to a prompt escape from the US in his Scientology naval fleet, all the while being investigated by both the FBI and the FDA, as Scientology was selling rather questionable cures, treatments, pills, and all manner of rather dangerous substances, which tarnished the reputation of Scientology globally, and leading to multiple bans in nations, such as in swaths of Australia and the UK, where ironically enough Hubbard and his people would be all but labeled undesirable alien, which led to many of the practices that Hubbard would instill in Scientology, including ethics technology and a policy of enforced punishments for perceived infractions from anyone, including potentially a woman who was attempting to leave Scientology and had a car crash, who could be labeled a subversive person, but more often than not would be people who were critical of Scientology, a move that mirrored Hubbard's deepening mistrust and his belief that saboteurs were everywhere, which led to Scientology introducing stringent measures in order to maintain control of those members who may want to leave or may be losing faith, or even would consider talking to others about what was happening and what Scientologists actually believed. Members were required to submit knowledge reports, which was akin to neighbors tattling on neighbors in the Soviet Union, where they would report any and all Scientology method misuse or transgression amongst their peers, leading to the infamous fair game policy, which was believed to have been connected with the loss of life of McPherson. This would include legal actions being taken against them, harassment, stalking, private investigators, constant surveillance, and a myriad of things which could lead to a mental break that caused you to strip down and run in the middle of traffic. Numerous reports detail property damage, pet harm, relentless stalking, and it was to the point that in 1966, Hubbard would establish something known as the Guardian's Office, led by his wife, Mary Sue, to manage external affairs, including legal matters and intelligence gathering, who would use job infiltrations, and they would go on to inform other members if and when they saw actions that could lead to negativity being spread about Scientology, which would include cases like those of McPherson, and they would act upon this information. Members of the Guardian's Office would even go to extreme lengths, infiltrating and even burglarizing various government agencies, including the US Department of Justice and the Internal Revenue Service. Guardian Office members would even be caught at the IRS headquarters in Washington, D.C., and this would lead to the FBI conducting simultaneous raids on GO offices in Los Angeles and D.C. on July 7, 1977, which shows how far they are willing to go in order to keep their religion as dominant as they can in the lives of every last member. After this, Hubbard was supposedly to step back, and after he escaped and fled, but in reality, he didn't, leading to his practices and the beliefs he instilled to become further ingrained within Scientology. Now, with the knowledge of what they believe and what they are willing to do, we can see that what would have happened to Lisa McPherson would not be outside of the norm, which are detailed in the care logs that the Scientologists kept. In particular, it shows that on December 5th, 1995, the situation surrounding Lisa had taken a turn for the worse, and staffers would reach out to Dr. David Minkoff, a fellow Scientologist and physician. Apparently how they had treated her had gotten to the point that they believed that they had to urge him to prescribe antibiotics because they suspected an infection, as concerns were even raised about McPherson's appearance, one staffer noting that she looked rather unwell, and even seemed like she had the chickenpox or measles on her face. Post-mortem examinations would later reveal that some of these lesions were actually cockroach bites, almost guaranteeably gained during the forced isolation conducted by the Scientologists. However, unlike what one would expect, Dr. Minkoff refused to prescribe medication without examining Lisa first, and he would go on so far as to emphasize the need for a proper medical evaluation, suggesting that they take her to a hospital. And it seems that the main thing that the Scientologists were worried about would be psychiatric intervention, not her health. But eventually they would relent. During her transport to the hospital, Lisa's condition would deteriorate rather quickly. A senior medical officer at the Fort Harrison base would observe and note her struggle to breathe, and stated that she was having labored gasps for air. And despite all this, they decided to skip a bunch of hospitals that were on their way and just drive straight to the destination, the hospital where Dr. Minkoff was based off of, in order to avoid the dreaded psychological evaluation, because in their religion it was all but verboten. Upon her arrival at the hospital, located 45 minutes north of Clearwater, Lisa showed no signs of life, and despite the best efforts of the hospital staff to resurrect her, she was declared dead upon arrival. Lisa McPherson had died at the age of 36, as it was labeled under suspicious circumstances at Fort Harrison. Initially, Scientology representatives informed her family that she had died due to meningitis or a blood clot during her period of relaxation under their care. However, an investigation would ensue and an autopsy would be conducted, and the findings of the autopsy would reveal that the cause of death was attributed to a thromboembolism in the left pulmonary artery, resulting from prolonged bed rest, being restrained, and severe dehydration. However, despite her emaciated state, the manner and direct cause of death remained officially undetermined. Medical examiner Joanne Wood would note that McPherson's decline was gradual, estimating she had gone without fluids for 5 to 10 days, something which could be attributed to severe forced isolation. Now, concerned about the negative publicity, members of Scientology sought to access the autopsy files, blood samples, and organ tissues, going so far as to threaten legal action against the medical examiner. They would then go on to enlist a team of their own medical examiners, including renowned pathologists, to dispute the findings. And wouldn't you guess it, the guys Scientology hired would agree with them. There was an alternate scenario, and they suggested McPherson's death was due to a sudden blood clot resulting from an ankle injury supposedly sustained in a prior car accident. They also argued against the claims of severe dehydration, citing tests that showed no ketones, compounds which would be typically found in cases of dehydrated individuals. Furthermore, Scientology presented evidence countering allegations of substantial weight loss during McPherson's time under their care. Reports from hospital doctors and officials attested to her already thin appearance prior to her stay at Fort Harrison. Additionally, they questioned the handling of the eye fluid samples, suggesting contamination and unreliable testing procedures. Eventually, there would be a court case, and the prosecution would state that the chain of custody had remained intact, and that there was no malfeasance as Scientologists claimed there was. Assistant State Attorney Douglas Crowell's memo to State Attorney Bernie Maccabee supported this stance. Doctors Barden and Wecht attested to McPherson's dehydration based on vitreous fluid tests. Chemical pathologists Calvin Band and Warner Spitz concurred with the initial report, and one Dr. Alan Wu, a witness for the prosecution, testified that ketones were not always present in cases like McPherson's, where she would have consumed proteins, making that test not viable, something that the Scientologists' medical examiners would have clearly known. The plaintiffs would argue that McPherson's had indeed lost water weight, resulting in her post-mortem weight of 108 pounds, and their presentation of new evidence, which contradicted their previous statements, required a review, where medical examiner Wood's review would attribute McPherson's pulmonary embolism to her psychosis and the car accident, leading the cause of death to go from undetermined to accidental. Despite the review, dissatisfaction would still linger, leading to a civil suit against Scientology, which was settled out of court. However, protests would persist outside of Fort Harrison Hotel, in particular on the anniversary of McPherson's death. Many believed that the church had killed her in all but name, and were the primary contributors to her demise. However, the lack of substantial evidence led to criminal charges not being pursued. Many believe this was either because of Scientology's deep pockets or their aggressive tactics thwarting most legal challenges, and these policies followed Hubbard's established commands. While Scientology claims continuous expansion and prosperity despite what they state is undeserved adversities, critics argue that the organization's self-reported statistics contradict the narrative of growth. Moreover, the church vehemently denies any allegations of criminal abuse, attributing such accusations to embittered former members seeking to lash out and tarnish their reputation. However, many ex-members have pointed out, reality paints a different picture, as they have recounted experiences of violence, family separation, forced pregnancy terminations, extortion, harassment, and a litany of other, at times even more heinous crimes. For them, Scientology has had nothing but damaging impacts on their lives. If you remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.